American ethnobotanist Dr. Paul Alan Cox was named one of Time magazine's Heroes of Medicine for his search in remote island villages for new medicines. He was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize for founding Seacology, a global island conservation charity headquartered in Berkeley. He received his Ph.D. at Harvard and then was appointed as a Miller Fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. After serving as dean at BYU, he became the King Carl XVI's Gustaf Professor in Sweden. His search at the brain chemistry lab in Jason Hall for new treatments for Alzheimer's disease was recently profiled by Dr. Sanjay Gupta for a short documentary for CNN. He has published 200 scientific papers and 4 books. Thank you very much.
Of course, Una.
So, actually, the inspiration for this interview is the new course at McKenna's Academy, which is devoted to ethnobotany and your lecture. I also, after that, bought your book, which you wrote together
Yes,
with...
the publisher told me they sold one somewhere in Europe, so now I know. So that's great.
Actually, it was the last one I found on Amazon, and now you should supply more because in Europe it was the last one, really.
Well,
And I was super.
Michael and I are working on a new edition right now, so hopefully that'll be taken care of.
Great. And actually, what made me thought also about how we humans and our actions, how we ourselves are creating diseases was the case in Guam you studied, because during World War II, Guam for a moment became a war zone. And then after some years, a new totally mystical disease started to appear, which was connected in a way to Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And now we have war very close to our border, which is already quite a long time, and many wars are like popping up in other parts of the world. And Guam is a great example how we can look at the consequences, but also it was the way that lead us closer to understanding of Alzheimer's disease, which doesn't appear in Guam originally. And maybe we can start our conversation with your story about Guam, putting together maybe all those aspects I mentioned.
Sure, I'd be happy to discuss that with you, and I thank you for asking. What happened is in the late 90s, I had been working very carefully with Dr. Corden Cragg, Dr. John Butler, Dr. John Cardellina at the U.S. National Cancer Institute, looking for new treatments for HIV/AIDS. And based on our analysis of a Samoan herbal remedy, and with the permission of the healer and the village chiefs and the Prime Minister of Samoa, we had moved forward with the discovery of a compound called prostratin. Its technical name is 12,3-deoxy-4-bol. This was from a little tree that the natives there had been scraping the bark and boiling it, putting it into very hot water, straining out. It's sort of like a tea bag, and having the patient drink that water infusion. And this was a very novel way of novel mechanism of treating HIV/AIDS. So once that was sort of launched, albeit slowly through the pharmaceutical pipeline, I became very interested in Guam. There was an article in the New Yorker magazine, and I think in the late 1990s, called A Curious Malady. And I don't know if you're this way when you're in the field, but I really treasure the time I have in the field to catch up on the New York Times or the New Yorker magazine in this case. And I was reading this about this disease in Guam. And of course, I'd heard a little bit about it, not much. And while I was sitting on the beach in Samoa in the evening thinking about this, a big flight of flying foxes flew over. And I suddenly thought, oh my, maybe the proclivity of the Chamorro people to eat flying fox flesh had something to do with the disease, because perhaps these animals eat cycad seeds.
Hmm.
So the other thing is, I was looking for a new problem now. I had become very emotionally attached to the HIV/AIDS community. Then it was a very sort of disease in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and some of the aspects of the disease many aspects were very social. People being rejected by their families, kicked out of their jobs. It was really terrible in the United States. Perhaps it wasn't that bad in Europe, but in the US it was really rough. So I was looking for something where there was a disease that had not had significant drug development with societal aspects where it hurt whole families and communities. And so I thought, well, maybe I should start doing this. So I assembled a team. Dr. Sandra Bannock had been a graduate student of mine and now is a professor in California. Dr. Susan Murch, extremely gifted amino acid chemist, and I'll get into that in a moment. Dr. John Steele was a local neurologist. Dr. Patricia Stewart was a physician. And so we quietly started making expeditions to Guam in the late 1970s and early 2000s. I think we made 5 or 6 expeditions. The disease was very unusual. It was really confined to 2 villages, Pneumatic and Mauricio, on the south side of the island of Guam. This was fairly remote within Guam. It had only recently had a road put into it. People there were more likely to embrace a traditional lifestyle. And since I'm an ethnobotanist and not a clinician, I don't hang around the clinic with a white coat and a stethoscope. I do my best to learn the people's language, and we go out and visit the people in their homes. I think we visited nearly every family in both villages, and we didn't find a single family that was not impacted by this. To give this perspective, this disease at its peak was killing 25% of the adults. And these adults had different neurological symptoms. Sometimes it appeared paralytic like ALS. Sometimes it appeared to be Parkinsonism. Sometimes, and always it seemed for older people, they had dementia, Alzheimer's type dementia. Some poor people had multiple indications. It was just really terrible malady. We became fascinated in the people's consumption of these flying foxes and observed the flying foxes eating the seeds of the cycad trees. I knew as a botanist that cycad trees have aerial roots that harbor cyanobacteria. We cultured the cyanobacteria in our laboratory. We were then based in Hawaii, and discovered that they were producing a very unusual neurotoxin called BMAA, beta
Hmm.
methylamino L-alanine, which is an unusual amino acid. In our bodies, our proteins are made up of 20 different amino acids, but there's thousands of amino acids in nature. And this is one of the ones that are not involved in protein formation. Meanwhile, I had started a conservation foundation, and one of the board members was Marcia Williams, who was the spouse of Robin Williams, a rather well-known American comedian and TV personality. And she was visiting me in Hawaii and started asking about cycad trees, and I explained a little bit about our work. She said, "Oh, well, I'd like you to talk to Oliver Sacks." Oliver Sacks was a very prominent neurologist in the USA. He's British. He'd written a number of important books. And I said, well, a little ethnobotanist like me on small islands. We were living on the island of Kauai. I don't think I should be contacting these world famous sort of people. Well, within about a week or two, I got a letter from Oliver Sacks. And he said, Marcia Williams told me that you've been working on this Guam disease, and I'd love to hear more. So I flew out to New York City where he lived, went to see him, and I told him about our work. And he called in his research assistant and said, I think this guy solved the Guam problem. And so I said, well, Dr. Sachs, if you agree with that, would you be willing to publish with me? So this was my first article in the journal Neurology, which is one of the leading journals in neurological science, and it was Cox and Sachs. Um, Meanwhile, our work progressed and we had more compelling data. We obtained autopsy tissue from some of the villagers who had passed away. And so I said to my team, I had some a graduate student and a couple of postdocs. I said, we could be self-deluded. Here we are in the middle of this beautiful island, but we're pretty isolated. I think we need to have other eyes looking at what we're doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
He said, well, what are you saying, Paul? I'm saying, well, I think we should go to Stockholm. I had been a member of, well, still am a member of the Royal Academy of Forestry in Sweden. And so I called up the academy and said, could I come out with some students and we'd like to make some presentations in a closed session for neurologists and chemists and physiologists. And they were very kind, agreed. So we went out there. I think this was probably in April of 2003.
Mm-hmm.
We presented our data on the Guam problem, and that took about an hour. And then we're waiting for responses. And nobody said anything. I was an audience of maybe 50 or 60 people just sitting silently there. And this was actually in the Academy headquarters on Lily Frascati, where they decide who gets the Nobel Prize. I mean, it's a sort of a prestigious venue. And finally, I stood up. I said, you need to know that I'm very fond of Sweden. And I'd served as the King's professor. And I said, but we came here to be criticized. That's why there's 2 hours. And if we're deadly wrong, if we're missing something important, I'd rather be shot at by my friends than my enemies. So please, you have 2 hours here to criticize what we've just said. And a very distinguished neurologist at the Karolinska Institute, a guy named Sebastian Conradi, raised his hand. He was an ALS expert. And he said, Paul, you need to know that when your paper came out with Oliver Sacks, it was the topic of cocktail jokes here in Stockholm. He said, we called it your batty hypothesis. He said, but now we've seen the data. He said, we don't want to criticize. We want to collaborate. We want to be part of this research. So that began our collaboration. The other interesting thing is that we'd submitted a paper to the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a fairly prestigious journal. And boy, they started moving really fast on it. So I had to call up the Academy and said, could you slow down publication? And the editor said, Paul, all the years I've been an editor, I've never had anybody call me up and ask me to slow down publication. I said, well, there's some people I want to talk to before this appears in print. So they agreed. So we flew back to Guam. We went back house to house because I wanted the indigenous people to hear it from me first and not from a newspaper account. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something we can come back to. But as an ethnobotanist, I'm responsible not just to my scientific colleagues, I'm also responsible to the indigenous people who I work with. And so we went around house to house and told the Chamorro people, look, we've done a lot of research on this now. We're grateful for your help. And we believe that it's this habit of eating flying foxes that's led to this outbreak of disease. And then waited for what they would say. And this is a dangerous thing to do, really, as an ethnobotanist, because part of our training is not to interfere with the indigenous culture. And yet we had discovered something that none of the researchers at NIH had ever figured out. So that flying foxes, these are very large bats. Tropus marianus is one of the species. That this is the most salient food item, culturally salient food item among the Chamorro culture. And they said, thank you. We didn't know what was making us sick. Now we can protect our children. So the papers came out. We later discovered that this weird neurotoxin produced by the cyanobacteria inserts itself into developing proteins and causes them to misfold. Other great researchers found that all of the neuropathological indications of Alzheimer's, of ALS, of motor neuron disease, which we call in the United States ALS, and Alzheimer's occurred in the brain tissues of these Chamorro people. We also found that BMA occurred in the brains of the Chamorro people with the disease, but not in control tissues. For
Hmm.
people in Canada who we've added to the mix, randomized, except for several patients. And when we broke the blind, we saw that they're the ones that had died from Alzheimer's disease. So suddenly we realized you could be exposed to this bacterial toxin almost anywhere. You didn't have to go to Guam. And that sort of green scum on lakes, uh,
Hmm.
those are cyanobacteria. And we subsequently discovered that nearly all cyanobacteria can produce this toxin at certain stages of their life cycle. So based on that, we began working very earnestly to find a way to block the toxin. That research done by our Australian colleagues is now in advanced clinical trials at Houston Methodist. We're pretty excited about it. We've been working on ways to diagnose very early the disease. So I'm really pleased in that what's a terrible tragedy for the Chamorro people, of course, this terrible epidemic down there is now yielding some insights that can maybe help people everywhere in the world in protecting
Hmm.
themselves from Alzheimer's or other neurodegenerative diseases. I'm sorry, I've talked too long. Let me stop there.
But that mean in a way tomorrow people were eating flying foxes already for centuries.
That's a really great insight, Una. And because you asked such a great question, you have a place now in my laboratory here in the Rocky Mountains. I love good questions like that. Yes, they had been. And there was a low level of the disease, which the Chamorro people in their language called litigo bodig. But what happened is in the aftermath of World War II, in World War II, Japanese forces took Guam. And after the United States militarily removed the Japanese, the USGIs shared with the Chamorro villagers semi-automatic weapons, which they immediately started using in collecting flying foxes. Prior to this time, the way to capture a flying fox for a Chamorro is to weave like a little basket, looks sort of like a lacrosse playing tool on the end of a big pole. And you stand around breadfruit trees and then try to capture them at nighttime, flying around or off the tree. Suddenly now, with a semi-automatic weapon, Chamorros could shoot and kill tens and sometimes hundreds of animals. We met
Hmm.
Chamorros who had been eating 5 flying foxes a week. We calculated the dose they received from each flying fox was the equivalent to eating hundreds of kilograms of cycad flour made from the gametophyte of the cycad. So I think that this is what really happened. And when we plotted the rise of mortality of the disease, we could see that it coincided pretty well with the advent of American weapons being given to the Chamorros. Um, and in fact, when we were doing these studies, there was only one remaining population of flying foxes. One species had been driven into extinction, the other one was endangered, and the only
Hmm.
population that remained was on a United States military airbase that had B-1 bombers and nuclear weapon bunkers and a pretty scary place. And I had interviews with two Chamorros who took their guns, went over the fence around the security measures, shot a flying fox, took it and repeated the same procedure for egress, which suggested that they either had a very strong taste for flying fox flesh or that the much vaunted security procedures of the United States were really not up to snuff. So that was where the hypothesis began. It came sort of from not the center core of neurology, but we had some world-class neurologists obviously working with this. And it was initially, I think, perhaps even unfairly excluded from consideration, but now our findings are pretty well embraced by the neurological community. For
Mm.
example, we found that the Chamorro people, if they left the village and immigrated to California, they could be in California 10 or 15 years and then get this disease, a very distinctive disease, which suggested to us that there's latency time in these diseases. And when we published that there was latency time for 15 to 20 years for Alzheimer's disease, early in the early 2000s in PNAS, neurological committee was not there to accept that. Now there is. And all of these diseases now, Parkinson's and ALS, are believed to have a prodromal period where there's not active symptomology, but they're slowly sort of incubating.
Mm. Basically, flying foxes, which at the beginning were like a food kind of medicine for native people, became a poison in a way because there was this overdose, and also there was war situation which had its consequences.
Yes, no, this is true. We discovered that the if we compare the amount of the toxin in
Mhm.
just the seeds and compare that to what's in the flying foxes, there was a 10,000-fold biomagnification increase in the amount of the toxin. And when I first started working on it, it reminded me very much about Minamata disease in Japan, in an area of the coast called Minamata. People were getting a terrible neurological illness. Nobody knew what was going on, and then a neurologist visiting saw a cat walk sideways, and
Mhm.
suddenly they realized it was due to an accumulation of mercury in fish that people were catching from the bay. People were getting mercury poisoned from this. So here was a natural compound, BMAA, which we found was being biomagnified in the Guam environment. Subsequently, we found our colleagues in Stockholm discovered this being biomagnified in the Baltic, and our colleagues, William Camus, the neurologist, really gifted neurologist in France, University of Montpellier, found it was being biomagnified in the Tao Lagoon, and our colleagues in China find the same thing at Lake Taihu. So
Mhm.
this seems to be, as I said before, what was sort of frightening to us is that we thought we were working on a small village disease. It turns out that this toxin that's implicated, people can be exposed to it almost anywhere in the world.
Yeah, following the latest statistics, I think we here in Latvia have more than 8,000 Alzheimer's patients at the moment. I think it's data from 2021 or 23. So it's a problem everywhere. But if I ask you to summarize, what is causing Alzheimer's? What is the very basic roots of
Yeah,
this disease? Because it's disease of our time.
I like this question very much because, I mean, at the base, what our laboratory is based on is it's protein misfolding that leads to the disease.
Mhm.
And on this, we differ from Big Pharma because Big Pharma says it's protein misfolds like beta amyloid 42 or misfolded tau protein that causes the disease. Based on our studies in Guam, we're saying no, that's not the cause, that's the symptoms. And so our efforts have been to find ways to block protein misfolding. So then the bigger question is, why do proteins misfold? We think in Guam we found one path, this weird neurotoxin BMAA, but there may be many paths to Alzheimer's, many paths to Parkinson's or ALS. And so there's an emerging concept right now, which is called the exposome. It's basically the exposome is the amount of toxic exposures you've had from birth to death and how you integrate them in your body. And right now, a friend and a very gifted Parkinson's researcher, Professor Raymond Dorsey at the medical school at the University of Rochester, has been arguing that most Parkinson's diseases cases comes from toxic exposures. In his case, to some sort of agricultural chemicals. Um, there's also interest now that this may be one of the roads to Alzheimer's disease. So just like if you think about the Chamorro condition where these people had a low level of this disease, Suddenly they're given automatic weapons, so they're able to increase their consumption of these toxic flying foxes. In industrialized countries like Latvia or Estonia or Canada or the United States, we have an aging population, and we know that risk of these diseases increases with age. Plus, we face now new chemicals, new environmental challenges that our parents and grandparents didn't face, frankly. Um, Rotenone, Roundup, other herbicides. So we're increasing the amount of toxic exposures, which we've changed in the last generation, the exposome, and we've increased in age to increase our vulnerability just by age to these diseases. So it's not surprising that the incidence, unfortunately, is going up.
But do we have also natural mechanisms in our bodies that help us to deal with protein misfolding and neurotoxicity?
That's correct. And that's one thing that we're quite interested in right now. After we understood what was happening with the Chamorros, we wanted to see if we could reproduce that disease in an animal model. This took us to the island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean, where there's a very nice, there's two veterinarian schools there. A lovely place. I think you'd like it, Una. It's your sort of place. Nice beaches, that sort of thing. But there's a very good facility for animal research called Behavioral Sciences Foundation. What happened in the case of St. Kitts is that 150 years ago, vervets were introduced from Africa by a sailor, and there are no natural predators, so their population exploded. So right now in the island of St. Kitts, there's more vervets than people, about 40,000 vervets. And this facility is so nice, it's like a zoo that the wild animals try to break in the evening to get into it. So we got very interested in seeing if we could replicate the disease by giving chronic slow doses. We took a village dose from Guam, um, which how much a Chamorro villager would receive over 20 years based on our ethnobotanical studies. Telescoped that into 141-day exposure for the animals, which did not cause them distress in any way. And after 141 days, they developed all the neuropathology that the Chamorro villagers had. Um, and yet, something really interested me because we could see ALS neuropathology, we could see Parkinson's neuropathology. We have an extremely gifted neuropathologist working with us, Dr. David Davis, who runs the Miami Brain Bank. And we could see ALS neuropathology consistent with human neuropathology. But we decided to expose a couple of animals and then just stop exposure, but allow the animals to live their life. And a couple of these cleared themselves of these protein. We actually haven't published that yet. We're working on it,
Mhm.
but we think there's a clearance mechanism, like you said. We know
Mhm.
within the brain there's a thing called the unfolded protein response that occurs inside of ribosomes. But we think there's other mechanisms that can remove protein misfolds. So then the new paradigm we have is that, yeah, we all develop protein misfolds occasionally, but our bodies have a way to repair this, to remove this. But as we get older, that repair mechanism starts getting a little dysfunctional occasionally. And so what we're really trying to find a way is to talk to that repair mechanism, because
Mhm.
that, of course, would be our goal to fight the disease by sort of turbocharging the repair mechanism that already exists in people.
Yeah, and this brings us also to your research about L-serine. And in the same time, it led you also to Japan, to island of Okinawa and Ogimi village, which never heard about Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I mean, I once we had confirmation in an animal model, and we published this in the Proceedings of the Royal Society in London. I did one of my degrees in the UK, and my grandmother, all my people come from England, so it's sort of like the mother country for me. I wanted to find a human sort of contrast to the Chamorro people of Guam. And this took me a while. I should have realized it much more quickly than I did. But I got very interested in the idea of these blue zones and realized if you're going to live to be 100, 105, 110, you probably have to have an intact neurological system. So I went to Ogimi on the very northern tip of Okinawa. Now, Ogimi is known in Japan as Longevity Village. And Okinawa is an interesting place. I'm very fond of the people there, but they were not part of Japan until the mid 19th century. So they have their own language and culture, which is different from the culture of Japan. Everybody learns Japanese in school, so we can talk to people in Japanese, but they have their own language. This little village in Ogimi has a language separate from the rest of Okinawa. So I went to Ogimi, I met with their chief's council and asked their permission to hang out there and start trying to learn from the people. And I have to say, it's one of the most astonishing experiences of my lifetime. Um, because these people had no record ever of anybody that lived and grew in that village of having Alzheimer's disease. I did 50 intensive 1 hour interviews with people in Ogimi, and only one had a slight hand tremor. And it turned out that she had had some back surgery, and the surgeon had touched her spinal cord. So there was just sort of a resting, stable tremor. No indications of ALS. And as I learned the language and began to describe to them why Alzheimer's is so frightening to us in Europe and North America, they were astonished. They had no concept of a disease that hits the elderly. And and their concept of aging is so astonishingly different than ours because they have um, uh, complete memory of their lifetimes, clear back to when their age is 3 or 4. When I
Wow.
was first starting this study in I asked an Ogimi woman, "Tell me about the war." She said, "Which war?" Responded, "The World War." And she said, "Which World War?" I mean, to sit with somebody that can remember back that far is just astonishing. And I was so deeply moved by their kindness to me, by their stories, understanding their lives. And, I'd ask, well, why does everybody live here so long? I mean, there's people 111 years old out chopping wood. I tell you, Una, if I could take you to this place, it would change forever your view of aging, forever. I can't keep up with these people. They get up in the morning, the women play the sanshin, their little banjo. Do I have one here somewhere? Um, they sing, they dance, they play little mind games. Um, they have a religion which is different from the rest of Okinawa, and I don't claim to understand the religion, but part of it is that they get together every 9 or 10 days and they dose themselves with certain seaweeds. So as we took their diet back to the Jackson Hole, where my laboratory is now, at the Brain
Mhm.
Chemistry Labs, and started deconstructing their diet, we find that they're getting about 4 to 5 times the amount of an amino acid called L-serine in their diet as we get. We'd already, with our colleagues in Australia, particularly Dr. Rachel Dunlop, and Dr. Ken Rogers, had discovered that L-serine blocks BMA insertion into neuroproteins. But it does a lot of other interesting things too. It turns out that L-serine residues are the typical phosphorylation sites on neuroproteins. About 92% of the sites. This is how proteins are charged and wound up. And um, so based on that, and we discovered in the vervets in St. Kitts that when we gave them L-serine added to their diet, that it blocked the neuropathology, at least a lot of it. So we got permission from the United States FDA to begin again human clinical trials. Started giving ALS patients L-serine and discovered, wow, boom, we could slow the course of their disease. So within a few months now, we'll finish a 100-patient trial for it's really an Alzheimer's trial. It's ran at the Nance National Alzheimer's Center, but we're looking at mild cognitive impairment. This is sort of a precursor to Alzheimer's disease And it's a randomized placebo-controlled study. FDA allowed us to look at the first 30 patients, and they were all significantly significant, the ones who were taking L-serine. So we're hopeful, but we won't know for sure till we see the data, and that'll probably occur later this year. So wouldn't it be fun if there could be a dietary way of reducing your risk of Alzheimer's disease?
Mm. But at the moment, it's phase 2 trial or
It's
already
a
phase?
phase 2 trial right now, and what's interesting, I've tried very hard to conduct the studies of L-serine as a regular drug. A lot of reasons for that. I think that people who have neurological issues should see their doctors, and I don't want people self-diagnosing, self-dosing, sort of stuff we see in particularly North American herbal medicine. I think in Europe, places like Sweden or Switzerland or Germany, I don't know how it is in Latvia, but there seems to be more openness among the medical community to natural remedies. Um, anyway, I wanted to make sure that this is available to take as a drug. But if the trial works, we're hopeful it work, but we will not know until we get the data, the final data. Then to have FDA approve it as a drug, we have to go through what's called a phase 3 trial, which is much more expensive, 1,000 patients, 40 or $50 million minimum. We don't have that sort of funds. But the one strategy I'm thinking of is going back to the FDA and saying, look, we would like you to approve this on an emergency basis for the Chamorro people of Guam, because there aren't enough villagers to have a meaningful phase 3 trial. And they do live in a U.S. territory, they're U.S. citizens. We'd like their doctors to be able to prescribe this. We've shown it's safe. If we can show in this new trial it's strongly efficacious, then I think there's a chance they might consider doing that. And if we can get it approved for Chamorros. But let me just say one more thing here. And this is the problem with ethnobotany, is that we're very vulnerable to exploitation. And I don't think they've hit Europe yet, but there's been a number of these deep fake artificial intelligent videos where they use my image, CNN and an American news network came out to our lab in Jackson Hole and did a documentary. Well, they took my image and my voice from this and Dr. Sanjay Gupta, and they have me promoting hokey herbal cures that they claim can reverse Alzheimer's disease, honey and something else. And it's very distressing to me because I can't figure out how to get ahead of this and stopping it. So that's tough. And it's been very sad. A lot of people know me calling up saying, "Hey, Paul, what's this? You're promoting something?" And the answer is no, I'm not promoting anything. We don't sell anything from our not-for-profit organization. And trying to stop that's been very difficult. So if you have any ideas, let me know.
Yeah, it's the reality of our time, actually, and it can happen with everyone, and it leads people to do some totally strange things because people are still believing, and and they are not criticizing what they see. We need education how to look at all those fake news and anything, because it's information overload and it's difficult to distinguish sometimes.
Well, my kids can look at it and say, "Oh yeah, Dad, that's a deep fake video." To me, it just looks like me. It sounds like my voice, but it's not me. And they're preying on very vulnerable people because I suspect, that most of us have been touched by one of these diseases, particularly Alzheimer's disease, and our friends or relatives. And these are desperate people. So we've had two occasions now where people have either shown up in our laboratory with their partners suffering from progressed
Mm.
Alzheimer's disease, or even at my home. They're heartbroken to hear that, no, this is fake. We're not there yet. We don't know how to reverse Alzheimer's disease. So, as an ethnobotanist, again, as I indicated, we feel obligations both to our indigenous people, who we consider them as colleagues, to our scientific colleagues. We also sort of stand in this nexus between plant medicine used by indigenous people and herbal medicine, which is, I think, very well regulated in Europe. I mean, in
Mhm.
Germany, they have the German Commission E. I know the Swedish regulators quite well. Where in the United States, it doesn't have that level of regulation. It's considered to be a food supplement. And so some things are quite good here. Other things, maybe not so good. And it's not, these medications are not prescribed by physicians in the United States. Whereas, again, I don't know about Latvia, but in Sweden, Norway, Germany, you can go to your physician if you ask for a natural product remedy, they can prescribe one for you.
Mm.
And the German Commission, he accepts folk medicine as one of the indications of safety. So that's very interesting to me. I think Europe's very far ahead on this issue.
I would like to ask you a different question based also on your book and what you told me about the mornings of Okinawa Island people, that they are in their 80s, 90s, and maybe 100 years old. They are going in the morning to collect the seaweed. They are dancing, playing their instruments. There is a lot of joy and happiness in them and in the air. Do you think joy and happiness also plays a role in protection? Because now here in Europe we are, and also in America, we are living in our heads and we are highly intellectualized.
No, I think you make a good point. We know statistically that lifestyle choices can reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. For example, a number of studies have replicated the finding that consumption of a Mediterranean diet reduces risk of Alzheimer's disease. Um, One of the earliest indications clinically of Alzheimer's disease is social isolation, people withdrawing. Um, the Ogimi people certainly demonstrate that engaging in your community, and that's maybe something that we've lost in the industrialized societies. And maybe I'll be interested in your views on this soon, and maybe part of it is an artifact of the COVID pandemic. But my view is we should be more like them and exercise, of course. Um,
Mm.
and now recent studies show even something as brief as 30 minutes a day of active exercise can reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease. So there's a number of lifestyle choices. And I like what you say about joy. I'll tell you a little funny story. I mean, as ethnobotanists, we're of course we're always guests. We're very aware that we're guests in the cultures we're visiting, and we do our best to meet their requirements and obey their cultural standards. So I was interviewing two 98-year-old women in Ogimi. They were terrific. One was bouncing like this. So I had a video camera, and I always show people my technology. I have them film me, show them the film, make sure I call it my informed consent dialogue. I never do anything knowingly without primary previous consent from Indigenous people, including writing in a notebook with a pencil. I'll often say, you guys really remember stuff in your culture. In my culture, we don't have that developed. I have to write on a notebook. Can I have your permission to do that? They say yes, I go ahead. If they say no, then I stop. And I will only do things with their consent. So anyway, I was getting ready to leave, and this woman was doing all this bouncing and stuff. She's 98. She comes up and she puts her arm around me. This is not a Japanese behavior, okay? They have really distinct views of personal space. And then she puts her mouth up against my ear, and that's also non-Japanese. And she whispers in my ear in Japanese. She says, "I think you're sort of cute," she says. So when I get back, Ogimi is a pretty remote place. When I got back down to the capital city in Okinawa, Naha, I called my wife Barbara at home. I said, Barbara, I don't know what to do. I've got this 98-year-old woman hitting on me. And she said, well, Paul, is she hot? I said, yeah, she's really something. And Barbara said, well, be careful then, she said. So anyway, a lot of fun. But what's fascinating and wonderful, and I know you know this too, about being an ethnobotanist is almost anywhere I go in the world, I find people are very interested in plants. In Sweden, I spent a lot of time with the Sami reindeer herders up in northern Sweden and northern Finland and northern Norway. Remarkable people. I've worked in Africa, I've worked in South America, trained in South America, and then of course really worked extensively in the islands of the Pacific and Southeast Asia. And everywhere I go, people are interested in plants. I was very lucky when I was doing my PhD at Harvard University. I worked for a man named E.O. Wilson, a very famous creator of sociobiology. He wrote a book called Biophilia. The idea is that people have an innate interest and love for life. Well, I believe that, but I think we maybe ought to talk about phytophilia. Because if I walk into a little village and I open my plant press, well, here's an example. So I was working in Kenya by Somalia border, a lovely place called Watamu. Great people. I had been interested in the seagrasses that grow there, and I don't travel with my collection, so I'll always mail plants back to the lab because I have permits and stuff. So I went down to the little post office in Watamu Village, and the nice lady there said, "Oh, you'll have to get a custom stamp." Where do I do get that? From the soldiers. So I go down to soldiers where their hangout is, and these are people that you might find a little frightening. They're not particularly responsive. They have very large machine guns, and and so I walk in, and they were. I don't want to call them hostile, but I'd say guarded. Is that fair? Just sort of like, and so I switched into Swahili. I'd been learning Swahili, and I didn't speak it very well, but enough to get along. And as soon as I started speaking Swahili, they said, "Well, what do you have?" I said, "Well, I have these plants." And they said, "What sort of plants?" I opened my plant press that's in there and say, "Well, I have mikuku, I have masimbe." And they put their guns down. The guy says, "You understand masimbe?" I said, "Oh, yeah, it's great. You can cook the seeds. It's a philosodendron." He says, "Oh, my grandmother used to cook that for me." And suddenly I'm talking, these soldiers have disarmed themselves and they're all talking to me about their stories about these plants. And I'm bringing out the plant press. Finally, I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, but the plane to Nairobi's coming at the landing field. I've got to go." "Oh, no problem." Boom, 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 boom. They stand and say, "Just come back and talk to us again." So I found that so many places that when I start talking to people about plants, they light up. I like what you said, Una, about joy. Maybe that's what we're missing in European and American societies today is just a sense of wonder and awe and pleasure in being alive. And I sure feel that way around plants. And my experience is most people do, that they love to talk about plants, love to share with you their ideas about plants. When they find out that you can talk about plants in their language, they get fascinated. And I don't know if you remember this, Una. You're probably not old enough, but there was a science fiction movie by Steven Spielberg called E.T. Did you ever hear of that?
Hmm.
The extraterrestrial.
Yeah.
Question is, Spielberg answered a key question, which is why would extraterrestrials come to Earth from, light years away? Are they really going to come eat us? No, the caloric calculus doesn't make sense. E.T., it turns out, was a botanist. He's out collecting plants. And, yes, that is one reason why somebody would travel, would be to come collect plants. And it seems to be this fascination with plants. And it's remarkable. I mean, I have a daughter that lives in Vienna. I go by Stefanplatz next to the cathedral sometimes.
Mhm.
There's a beautiful little flower shop there that sells these wonderful plants. When I go there, they remember me. "Oh, it's you," they say, because I'm asking them questions about where they got them from, these little resurrection ferns or amaryllis. And it's sort of like, I don't know, you probably felt this soon. It's almost like a fraternity suddenly. We're members of the club of people who are aware of plants and love them. I mean, have you found that in your work, Una?
Yeah, of course, and it's like plants are connecting people, and I hope one day maybe plants help us um, to solve our problems and also those huge crises we have now in the world. Because plants in recent years, I feel they are coming to us in different ways. This happening also with psychedelic plants, and I spoke already with Dennis about that because here in Baltics we do not have this tradition of psychedelic plants because our our relation with plants was totally different since the beginning. But through the plants who traveled to us through ayahuasca, we are starting to discovering our own plant roots, and it's also something unbelievable in a way.
Sometimes the our interest in plants are culturally so deep. I taught some courses in ethnobotany at Uppsala University. And so I'd ask the students, do plants play an important role in Swedish culture? Well, no, blah, blah, blah. I said, well, do you have plants that you use at certain times of the year and not others? So we have a dinner. I always have a dinner, have people bring stuff and tell me about it. Turns out, yes, Sweden has certain potatoes they only eat certain times of the year. They have aquavit. I mean, everybody,
Mm.
it's interesting. I think there's some commonalities in cultures. You talk about psychedelics. Um, People don't think a lot about this, but I mean, the coffee pot is really a way of getting a dose of a psychoactive molecule, caffeine, just like kava or like khat in
Mhm.
Ethiopia. This is a type of psychedelic, and of course, Roger Lewin, the great German scientist, studied this as early as the 30s. These bind people together. In the old days, days of Samuel Johnson in London, they had chocolate before they had coffee. They had chocolate houses. And it's been really fun for me to see the rise of chocolate now. It's sort of being an acceptable beverage for adults to
Mm.
drink. Yes, theobromine is euphoric. It makes us happy. Um, and coffee, kava, bring us together. There's another category, however, of psychedelics that are more intense, personalized experiences. And of course, Professor McKenna is so expert on this. Um, but I find in my work that those sort of intense experiences are under very tight societal control. So places
Mm.
I've worked in the Amazon, you don't just go down as a kid and start blowing ayahuasca or Virola sap up your nose. It's there's really strict societal controls on that, and in many cultures, it's the healer, not the patient, that uses these intense psychedelic things. So I'm quite interested in that, and something that's interested me a lot, and maybe you have an answer for, is that certainly in North America, but I think in a lot of parts of Europe, Northern Europe particularly, there's been a change now where people who smoke cigarettes are being demonized. I mean, there's parts of
Mhm.
California you can't even walk into a park and smoke a cigarette, okay? Now, I'm not a smoker myself, but I'm
I'm,
fascinated in how people smoke, why they smoke, what they do, because but marijuana, cannabis, is now more accepted. And again, I can get on the train in Vienna and smell marijuana smoke. What is it that's made us as a society sort of demonize cigarette smoking, but accept cannabis smoking? That's interesting to me. What are the societal features that have caused that? And of course, the great neurotoxin that is used throughout the world is alcohol. Um,
yeah.
and that's particularly true. That's even true, of course, throughout Scandinavia. I mean, ethanol plays an important role in people's sociality. It also can have very tragic effects. So I'm fascinated in this. It seems like Prometheus discovering fire, human understanding of psychoactive substances is one with promise. Think of the
Hmm.
new treatments for PTSD, um, other psychiatric issues, but also with peril, because we have tremendous specters of, particularly in the United States, of drug dependence, and it's very sad. So again, here's where I'm interested. What are the rules that societies, different cultures, including indigenous cultures, how they understand, control, and use psychoactive substances?
And also, I wanted to ask you regarding Alzheimer's. There are clinical trials going on also with psilocybin and Alzheimer's. How do you say this?
I'm very interested. One of my professors, Richard Evans Schultes, was a great ethnobotanist at Harvard. What a terrific guy, and his network of investigators. So Albert Hoffman was a frequent visitor to Harvard when I was there, and we'd have Tuesday afternoons in the Botanical Museum for ethnobotany seminar, and there'd be, I don't know, 7 or 8 of us: Wade Davis, Michael Balick. others. One day it was just packed, all these people, I didn't know who they were. And Albert Hoffman came in and he drew a benzene ring on the blackboard. And the guy behind me said, far out. Well, I got to know Albert Hoffman. Of course, he worked at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Basel, Switzerland, where he was studying ergotamine alkaloids. And one that he named lysergic acid, diethylamide 25, was accidentally intoxicated himself. It was interesting because I knew Hoffman very well, and I knew, of course, Schultes. What's interesting about both these guys is that they were deeply opposed to recreational use of LSD, deeply opposed. They saw it as a therapeutic. And Hoffman told me, I was over in Basel after he was 100 years old. He was very excited because quietly clinical trials had started up for treatment of schizophrenia, which of course was his interest. Um, and so I've been paying a lot of attention now to people, particularly in California, who are microdosing LSD to treat clinical depression. A street dose of LSD is about 5 micrograms. Think of that. I mean, that is so small, 5 micrograms, not milligrams, but micrograms. These people are using half, 0.5 milligrams of LSD. But when I read their diary accounts and listen to them, they're saying, well, yes, and the magnolia tree is so beautiful. And I think, oh, that's too much. I mean, you're still, if you're having that level of hallucinatory effect, let's go down to 0.005. The issue for me, of course, is the FDA would never approve LSD 25 as a potential therapeutic drug because of the possibility of, you know, but I'm interested in the other 24 lysergic acid things that Hoffman discovered because I think it's very possible. We found some other things too that psychedelics may have a psychedelic peak, but they may have something else very functional. In this case, something that deals with clinical depression. Again, I don't know what the rates for clinical depression are in Latvia, but in the United States, about 27% of people report being clinically depressed at one time or another in their lives. And it's a very serious disease. It's a potentially terminal disease. We don't have sufficient treatments for it. We have serotonin uptake inhibitors, um, but still there's many people those don't touch. So I'm very interested to see once I move beyond the neurodegenerative diseases, if we can set up a 5-HT1 dopamine receptor assay in our lab and start looking at all the plants I've collected from indigenous people where they, I mean, but when you're saying as an ethnobotanist, looking at interested in medicine, and you ask a healer, what do you use this plant for? What do you use that plant for? And then you write down, oh, treats kidney disease or lowers fever or whatever, analgesic. And then they say things like, well, this is used to treat lightning disease. You say, lightning disease, what's that? Well, that's if, say, you see a lightning bolt hit a tree, it can cause this disease in you. Or this is for a loss of love. Or this, there's all these things that I just put down as other. Now I want to go back into that and see if these different plants are active against a 5-HT1 dopamine receptor assay, which is one of the key receptors involved in mood. Um, I really think that there's some real chances that we can look at the pharmacopoeia that indigenous people use, and Professor McKenna is way beyond me on this, but particularly looking at psychoactive plants. And I believe that Hoffman was right and Schultes was right, that there are new medicines that can be discovered that can treat some of our most serious psychiatric illnesses that we might can discover from these ethnobotanical studies.
Respecting your time, I have two questions left, and one is there is a term cognitive reserve. What does it mean, and how can we make it bigger? Because each of us, I suppose, have something.
If you think of knowledge like a reservoir,
Mm-hmm.
then if you build the reservoir up, when times of drought, you can reduce that reservoir, okay? And so that's the idea of a cognitive reserve. I had Andy Weil, who's a friend of mine. I have to tell you, when I've been so grateful because my students have all become very famous. I'm not particularly, my students have, my colleagues are very famous, and I've just been very lucky in life to meet these wonderful people. So Andy Weil came up to Jackson Hole, and I was talking to Andy. I said, Andy, can you explain to me why attempting to learn a foreign language reduces your risk of Alzheimer's disease? Did you know that? If you attempt to learn another language, it reduces your risk of Alzheimer's disease.
Mhm.
Andy said to me, well, maybe, Paul, if you can't conjugate the verb in English, you just use the Spanish conjugation, you know? I mean, I'd be very interested in Latvia, where so many people are bilingual and
Mhm.
they speak obviously Latvian, English, Russian, some even speak Swedish. And that would be an amazing study to see if that level of cognitive reserve has protected them. We do know that there are people who've lived normal lives cognitively, had no cognitive loss, and on autopsy, their brains filled with amyloid tangles and tau tangles. They find a way to sort of rewire the neurology, is the way I'm thinking about it. So I'm very interested. And this is a good idea. Well, how do you build your cognitive reserve? Listen to music. This is so important. Oliver Sacks felt very strongly about this. The women in Ogimi feel strongly about that. If you find music that elevates you, challenges you, raises your soul, listen to music, attend lectures, engage in conversations with others, watch podcasts, maybe this one, whatever you can to keep building that cognitive reserve as you age. That can only be of benefit. And you had one more question. Go ahead, Una.
Yes, and is there a hope that maybe in not so far future Alzheimer disease will be history like it is with polio?
Yes, in fact, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who's the medical doctor on CNN. He did a little documentary on me. You can go onto YouTube if you put my name, Paul Cox, Alzheimer's, CNN, it'll pop right up there. It's about a 7 minute little piece. But he told me, and I believe what he said, he said, the last Alzheimer's patient is alive right now. What he means by this is that this disease is going to be gone. Hopefully in my lifetime, hopefully in your lifetime, Una. We're going to find a way to defeat Alzheimer's, just like we defeated polio. When I was a little boy, I'd go in the hospital, see these rows of iron lungs. They had little mirrors, people there, so they could breathe for them. Now polio's gone. I think we're going to figure out Alzheimer's, and Sanjay Gupta, Dr. Gupta's view is that the last Alzheimer's patient is alive right now, and that'll be the end. There will be no more Alzheimer's patients. So I'm optimistic about these things, but I think going back to our roots, going back to indigenous knowledge, going back to the how plants work and why they're active can be a very important route to making some of these discoveries.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this conversation and for your time. And
I'm
I will
honored to know. Thank you.